Aldous Huxley was an English writer and philosopher. He wrote nearly 50 books. And here's his quote about history. That men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons of history. Welcome to the History Slices podcast, a mother-son duo discussing awesome bits of history. We prove on every show that history is not boring, entertaining, yet stimulating. This is History Slices. And now, here's your hosts, Jacob and Rachel.
Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Mom.
How you doing today?
Pretty good. How you doing?
Pretty good. Glad that we are here and lights and power and internet.
For context, for in case you're listening to this later on down the line or out of order or
3
whatever.
years from now.
We've just been through a historic storm and it very much disrupted our schedule and our electrical grid and our water supply. It was a whole debacle. Luckily, we're past that now.
Yeah, and so thankful. And we still have people in the area who are still getting power back after 12 days without power.
Jeez, I can't imagine.
Yeah, gosh.
I mean, I can, but I don't want to.
It was 6 days, I think, for us, 6 full days. And that was it was a doozy for sure. So anyway.
Today we're going to be doing something a little different.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit, I don't want to sound on a back foot, but it's a bit weird for me, if I can confess this to you.
Anything, Jacob.
Sure. Because usually I'm the one who has the story. Usually I have my notes all out in front of me. And I'm like, okay, here's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But this time the shoe's on the other foot and you're the one who's got the topic.
So are you feeling like I'm looking across the desk here at you and you don't have your laptop in front of you and I'm thinking, do you feel just like a little bit exposed?
It's
like,
a little, no, it's
unprepared?
just different. That's all.
Yeah.
Different's good usually.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Well, I'm curious as to what we're talking about today.
Well, I have greatly enjoyed the research part of this topic. I don't know if you remember because it's actually been a couple weeks. Usually we record at least one a week.
Yeah.
It's been a couple weeks since we probably mentioned this, but we're going to be talking about Ybor City today. That's the topic.
You've mentioned the city to me a couple times.
Well, and you've been there, so you know the place.
The cities look very similar to me.
Hopefully after this episode, you're going to be 100% squared away about Ybor City.
Sure.
Yeah. I already had some background knowledge about it because it's a personal place for me. It's a personal story, but I did learn some in my research too. And then this really has given me good insight to what you go through in preparing for talking about a new topic, and usually I just have the easy end. I'm just back here going, oh, what? Wow, really? I'm not asking questions, but it's really a difficult thing to gather information, figure out how to put it all together, organize it, and then try to make it coherent. So
that's the hardest part.
Yeah. So it was really fun digging into the information. But without further ado, let me just say that. So I mentioned that Ybor City is personal. It's a personal topic. And it's interesting to me because my mom was born in Ybor City in a neighborhood called Palmetto Beach.
Okay.
And she was born in a house, of course, with my grandmother. And the house is still in the family. So it's Abuelita's house.
Right.
Yeah. So even though I've never lived in Ybor City, grew up hearing stories about Ybor City and Tampa, and my mom loved it. So she talked about it and handed down stories and things like that. So my mom passed away in 2011, your grandmother.
Yes,
so this
I remember.
Coming up on the 10th anniversary this year of when she passed. And so I'd really like to dedicate this episode to her because I think if she were here, she would really love to hear it. So anyway, this is
very sweet.
Dedicated to my mom. We begin. Okay. As I said, I really struggled how to tell the story coherently. What I decided I would do would be like give a chronological telling or like the history of it chronologically. Some bits are going to be a little bit more fleshed out than others because some of it's just to kind of give context and some of it's got a little bit more interesting parts.
I think that's a great idea. And it helps me as well because I know kind of where we're going.
Yeah.
I know that thing that you say like.
That thing.
Yeah. Where you're like, I don't really know where we're going with this. I'm feeling that now.
Yeah, it's a little mysterious. You're like feeling around in the dark. So I'm telling you, we're going to do this sort of chronological thing with some beefy parts in it. But then we're going to go back to a couple parts that don't really fit into the timeline per se. And I just wanted to kind of flesh this out a little bit. I'm going to do that at the end.
Great.
But even before I get into the chronology of it, I just want to say what Ybor City is now, because people may not know. What is it? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
So Ybor City is a National Historic District within the city of Tampa. It's like a little city within a city. And
that's a little confusing. If it's a district, but it's inside a city, but it's called a city.
Well, it was annexed actually by the city of Tampa, like in the late 1800s, like 1887. So
it was that makes it sound like Tampa was like a country or something, of an annex. Something.
Actually, Tampa was a brand new city. Well, relatively, it was a couple years old, I think. And we're going to get into how Ybor City started. And then they actually annexed just means it became part of the bigger Tampa city.
No, I hear that. It's just usually when I hear the word annex, I think of like, we annexed Hawaii or something like that. It's a different context that I'm used to.
I'm not sure if it was entirely, I don't know if everybody's happy with the annexation or not, but I think it was, it just is what it is. Okay, so today, Ybor City is sort of the Latin quarter of Tampa, in addition to the historic district. So it's been tried to be, I don't want to say it's like a theme city, but for people to go there out of interest of, the history of the Latin culture, nightlife, restaurants, art, that kind of thing. So people would go to Ybor City for those reasons today, if they don't live and work there. So that's kind of what it looks like today. There's a newspaper called La Gaceta, which is a trilingual newspaper. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in the thing. But today I just happened to look at it for, I forget something. And I'm going to read a quote from Patrick Mantega, who is, I think he's the grandson of the founder of it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The
founder of the newspaper?
The founder of the newspaper, I think it was founded in the 1920s. So this is his quote today about Ybor. It says, Ybor's success comes with little public investment. While Tampa dumps millions year after year in downtown projects, Ybor thrives without much love and nurturing. Ybor City is one of the best places to live, work, and play in a great city and dynamic region. Ybor City will only get better. Okay. I think it's kind of interesting because as you listen to the story I'm about to tell you about Ybor City, it's had like, I don't say traumatic, but dynamic, dramatic, if not traumatic.
Sure.
It's had a really dramatic history and of sort of tenacity and survival, and it's kind of cool. So
I do like how he was kind of throwing shade a little at Tampa there.
He did. Yeah, he kind of did. And I think it's interesting just the dynamics between Tampa and Ybor City, and we can speculate a lot about what he really means.
Sure. Yeah. I don't want to put words in those guys' mouth. With any relationship between like two entities, whether those are people or cities or countries or what have you, sports teams, whatever, there's always an interesting dynamic. That's what I find so fascinating about a lot of these type of things.
Yeah. And the history of this town and, Ybor City and him, I do believe he's the grandson. So he's aware of the history of Ybor City.
Oh, definitely.
And you'll get to hear a little bit about the dynamics there, what went into that and what Ybor City's been through. So
before we jump in there, I have one question.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's probably not the most relevant thing. The newspaper, what was it called again?
La Gaceta or La Gaceta.
Right. What does that mean in English?
The Gazette.
Oh, okay. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So the three languages it's printed in is English, Spanish, and Italian. It started in Spanish, and then it broadened out to Italian and English it kind of represents the population of,
so there's a lot of Italians
of Ybor City.
Ybor City?
It's very diverse.
Awesome. Cool.
Let's jump in and you're going to learn about, who's in there. How did it get started?
How did this happen?
How did that happen? Why is it Latin? So all those good things. So going back to 1885, there is a man named Gavino Gutierrez. He was a Spaniard, I'm pretty sure.
With that name.
Almost certain he was a Spaniard, but he was living in New York City and he was a civil engineer. I think he worked for a guava manufacturing plant, and he came down to Florida to the Tampa Bay area looking for guavas to supply this plant because somebody had told him, there's a lot of guavas down there, it'd be great. So he went to investigate on his own.
Sure. Smart.
Back then it was a massive trip because, I don't know if he took a boat from New York to Jacksonville area or something, but there wasn't a train from the east coast of Florida to the Gulf Coast, which is where Tampa, Florida, that the Bay Area is. So he had to take a stagecoach or something, and it was just really uncomfortable travel.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I've heard that Florida, before it got all urbanized and stuff, was very treacherous. Not a lot of people were there because it was very swampy and very kind of just
uninhabitable.
Yeah, it's very low to the sea level and all that stuff. There's a lot of factors
mosquitoes
there.
And
yeah,
just oppressive feeling with the water in the air. What am I thinking? The humidity.
Yeah, that's the word.
The humidity.
Water,
Anyway, so this guy came down. He made it to Tampa Bay area. Didn't see one guava anywhere.
Okay. Well, it's a good thing he went himself then.
Yeah, he went to go check it out. And so it was kind of a bust from that perspective, but he realized that the way that Tampa is positioned, it's got a bay, it's got a river. It was actually could potentially be a good place for business. So before he went back to New York, and hopefully, let me just say this as an aside for the rest of the episode, hopefully I've got my facts straight and the dates and everything right. So if I've, made an error somewhere and the area, the history, by all means, chime and connect with me, because I would love to connect with anybody to the audience. I'd love to connect with anybody who knows the story. And, I've got some notes in front of me, but I'm trying not to do anything.
Honestly, let me be very frank with you. That feeling that I hope this is all accurate. That is in every episode ever. Because I'm pretty sure this is, but someone might know about more.
Yeah.
It's all good. Don't worry about it.
Awesome. Okay, so going back to Gutierrez. So after he left Tampa, he didn't go straight back to New York. He wanted to go visit some friends of his who were in Key West.
Okay.
The friends of his were Vicente Martinez Ybor and his friend Ignacio Aya, both of whom were cigar manufacturers from Cuba. I think Aya I think had a cigar manufacturing place in New York as well as in Key West. And Ybor had cigar manufacturing places in Key West. I'm not sure if he still had one in Cuba at this time. He actually fled Cuba. He was exiled to Key West.
Oh, wow.
For his safety, because he spoke out against the Spanish rule in Cuba, because at that time Cuba was a Spanish colony.
Yeah.
And even though Ybor was actually originally from Spain, he'd lived in Cuba for about 15 years, and he was on the side of the Cuban independence.
Sure,
the Spanish government didn't like that at all, and so he kind of feared for his safety and his family. So he moved to Key West, and he eventually moved his cigar making business to Key West. And
Spain is usually historically and kind of contemporarily kind of against people breaking out of their country. I imagine a lot of countries are like that, but I'm just reminded
once you work
of
hard to establish, yourself.
I'm just thinking back to what's that area in I think it's northern Spain, starts with a C. They're always kind of about independence or something like that.
Catalonia.
Yeah. I hear about that occasionally, and I'm kind of reminded of that, and how the Spanish government is no.
I think I don't want to paint any people with a broad brush, but it really seems like people with Spanish blood in them, and maybe Latin people in general, Italians and everything, that they really are passionate about things. So,
well, I mean, it's good to be passionate about stuff, honestly,
especially when it comes to things like freedom and
there are some things I wish I was more passionate about, honestly.
So the year again is about 1885.
Okay.
There's this meeting in Key West with Gutierrez, Aya, and Ybor.
That's so interesting. So you've got some businessmen, but
they're friends.
They're friends, but it's just the diverse background, kind of.
Well, and they all have the common thing that they're all from Spain originally, but they just kind of, when they came to but
they have different paths coming to the U.S.
They do, yeah. So it was really like a providential meeting actually in Key West at that time for Tampa Bay, because in the conversations they had there in Key West, Gutierrez, who was okay, Tampa's horrible for guava, but it could really make a great place for cigar making, because the climate is right. It's close to Cuba, which is where all the tobacco comes from. And it would be a great place to set up, shop up there. At the time,
it makes sense.
Both Aya and Ybor were looking for another place to be, because the situation, and I can tell right now, this is going to go way longer than one episode.
That's fine.
Okay. So at the time of this meeting of the three friends, Ybor was looking for a new place to set up shop. In Key West, Ybor was actually having labor issues because the workers would leave Key West to go back to Cuba, and they'd come back and forth between Cuba and Key West. So he had a hard time keeping a consistent labor force.
Right. That happens sometimes.
Yeah. And Aya, who I think he was established in New York, his cigar factories, and he was having trouble up there because he couldn't produce cigars year round because of the climate. So they were both kind of in the market for a new place to set up shop for Cigar Factories. So when they met with Aya, and Aya had all these, I'm sorry, not Aya, when they met with Gutierrez, and he had all these good things to say about the Tampa Bay area.
They're like awesome.
They're like awesome. And like the next day, there's a ferry that would travel between Key West and the Tampa Bay area, like weekly. At that time, it probably was like a paddle kind of ferry or something. But
this is the 1880s.
1880s, yeah. So they decided like the next day to go up there and check it out. So they went up there. They were happy with what they saw. And I don't know the exact dates and timelines and everything, but at that time, the population of Tampa itself was about 750 people. That's it.
Wow.
Yeah. And
that's very small.
it's so small. It's like an outpost almost.
I would not call that. That's like a town. That's not like a city.
And in fact, it wasn't even a city yet. It wasn't the city of Tampa at that time. It was just the town of Tampa, you know?
Yeah. I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
No, that's fine.
I'm just, that number is so shocking to me. Was like 100 and something?
750.
750. Okay. All right.
Like a third of your high school class.
Yeah.
Or your high school.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Like my high school, I think had more people than that.
Yeah. Your high school had over 2,000 people.
Yeah. So
a couple things happened. So at the time they were, like I said, they were looking for a new place to be. They had already had offers from other places in the southeastern United States, Galveston, someplace I think in Alabama, and I can't remember, a third place. At least 3 other places had
that
not
area.
only tried to offer them like, hey, come build your factories here, but giving incentives and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the South.
Yeah, that part of the South. So they were encouraging, they wanted some sort of industry to come to their towns to, build.
Yeah.
So
boost the economy.
Yeah,
get some money flowing.
Yeah. So at that time, there was not, like I said, there was not even a railroad going into Tampa from other parts, but there was one coming. So it was sort of an up and coming area. It was getting ready to be connected to the outside world, sort of that sort of thing. A deal was eventually made where Ybor bought. So Ybor was the first one to buy land there. He bought 500 acres.
Wow. Okay.
Right off the bat, and quickly grew into 2,000 acres that he bought. Aya also bought some land there, but only after Ybor sort of made that first move, I believe.
I like that, actually. It's like, okay, before you jump full end, feet first. Let's wait for someone else to go first.
Says, okay, so we're doing this.
Okay, all right.
And so he goes, but it was really like touch and go a little bit because Ybor wasn't happy with the price of the first parcel of land that he was offered, and he was getting ready to leave to go to talk to I don't remember if it was Galveston or whoever to try, because he was in a hurry to get this done.
Sure.
And then at that time there's a council in Tampa, some sort of business council, I forget who they were. They decided they would subsidize the purchase of his land to keep him there in Tampa. So they reached a deal, and he established his place there. It was called Ybor City. I think it was originally called Ybor's City.
That makes sense. Okay, I was going to ask, did he name it after himself?
Yeah, no, I think
seems a little big-headed.
I think it was just called Ybor's City.
Like, welcome to Jacobville.
Right. Right, yeah. So I
had no idea. I'm sorry. Before we started, I had no idea Ybor City was named after a person.
Oh, no kidding.
Ybor. Yeah.
No kidding.
No idea. I don't know where I thought the name came from. But yeah, so that was really interesting.
I wonder if when you were in Ybor City, because you've been there, I wonder if you just thought we were just in Tampa. But
it's very possible. That might be where some of my confusions come from.
Yeah. So it turns out, both Ybor and Aya built these cigar factories. The first cigar actually gets credited to Aya's factory because actually it's kind of detailed, but in Ybor's factory, and I think this might have been in Key West, Ybor's factory, they had a Spanish foreman, not a Cuban foreman, and they didn't want to work under him or something. So they were kind of like on a little strike.
Oh, so like tensions between the
even though
Cubans
Ybor
and
was
the
and that ends up being kind of a constant theme sort of throughout the next few decades is the relationship between the Cubans and the Spaniards and having to do with the different wars and things like that.
Is Tampa like I don't know if this is like the right way to phrase this question, or if it is even like a smart question or not. Is Tampa more of a Spanish city and Ybor's like more Cuban, or?
That's a good question. So
I'm wondering how far that division goes, basically, is what I'm asking.
I would actually say that Ybor City and an area called West Tampa are quote unquote Latin areas, more so Ybor City, which Cuban, Spanish, Italian, but a lot of Spanish and probably Cubans originally settled like in the West Tampa area. Outside of that, a lot of, I think, what they would just call Anglos, or what they would even have called crackers back then, you know. And there's a reason for them to be called that. So white people, yeah, outside of that. So whether or not Tampa is, I mean, it's really hard to know how to define that now. That's a good question. I don't really know how outsiders would define that.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just curious because you were telling me that, and I'm sort of going to go more into detail, but this division between Cuban people living in the area and Spanish people living in the area, and like I was wondering just how much that played in
such
like
a good question.
And it went on for decades apparently.
Actually, division is not really the right word because they did work hand in hand, and
so tension maybe,
and not always tension. Sometimes it wasn't, sometimes it wasn't.
Okay, it's complicated.
It is very complicated, and so some of it I'll spell out a little bit as we go on. But keep in mind that a lot of the Cubans actually were from Spanish descent. So there's also overlapping, you know, of loyalties. And then once in Ybor City, Spaniards marrying Cubans.
And sometimes it's just like, I can't remember if it was Ybor or Iowa. Is his name?
Aya. It's Haya.
Oh, wow.
Ignacio Aya.
Don't tell me how it's spelled because I would totally have mispronounced that. Like Hawa or something. Whichever one was, had left Cuba because of trouble with the Spanish authorities.
Yeah, that was Ybor.
Ybor, yeah. He's Spanish, you said, but his kind of loyalties or his favor is more towards the Cuban people.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just have like people who just jump lines and you wouldn't necessarily
That's what
expect.
I mean. It's complicated. It's not that there were these like this clearly defined tension or anything between the Spanish and the Cuban, because a lot of times they had the same goals, but sometimes because of how they thought or where they were from or what was going on outside, like in Cuba or in Spain, depending on the decade, you know, people thought of them differently. And like I said, that passion thing, you know, people spoke their mind. And, yeah. So it was
not much of a filter.
I think a very interesting place to live. So we're still at the very beginning. We're still at the birth of Ybor City.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to get us off on a tangent.
No trouble at all.
Curious.
I just know that this is long and it's probably going to be 2 episodes.
That's fine.
At least. So, okay. So to show you how fast things moved, 1885, they visited Ybor City, or Ybor City was born. I think they actually were there in 1884. My apologies.
That's fine.
By 1886, the first cigar workers arrived from Cuba. 176 workers' houses were constructed. Those houses were called casitas, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later.
All right.
And there were already 3,000 people handcrafting cigars in new factories.
Wow.
Like the year after this whole thing. So things were moving very fast. One thing is that cigar making is really like a craft. You know, it's not something that anybody could just walk in and do. So there were apprenticeships. Like it's a really highly regarded.
You have to learn
ability,
skill. It's not like a assembly line thing where someone can just be like, you know, do this bit, then this person does this bit. It's like you kind of have to, I don't know anything about cigar making, but I get the impression that you kind of have to do the whole thing, or at least know how to do like
you have to know.
Thing.
So there were specialty tasks within the cigar factory.
Sure.
Like some people would be the rollers and the makers. Other people would be picking out the tobacco leaves, and, you know, but there's also people who probably worked in the shipping, you know, bringing it in and sending it out, that sort of thing. So there were lots of different roles. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too later.
Oh, okay. Cool.
In particular, one role in the cigar factory, which is called the lector, which is the reader. Very fascinating. We're going to talk about that towards the end. Okay, so 1886, things are already cooking.
Right. We're in business.
We're in business.
We're booming.
1890, the population of Ybor City, 6,000.
Wow.
Remember,
I mean, I imagine
like 5 years earlier, Tampa only had 750 people.
Yeah, I imagine it's because all the workers coming in and their families coming with them.
They did. And, you know, in the beginning, people had to believe enough in Ybor and Aya and the whole situation to move their families from Key West or from Cuba to come up there to nothing. There was no city. There weren't roads.
Yeah.
There was nothing there. And at the beginning, workers were a little bit reluctant, like the first year and a half to commit to coming up there. So even though that seems like a large number, it actually was a little bit slow starting. And then another crazy thing happened is that soon after, like it was within the same year or so that they began, there was a terrible fire in Key West, which devastated lots of the factories down there, both I think the Ybor one and the Aya one that were both in Key West. So now the workers were like, okay, go back to Cuba or come up to Tampa to work.
When was this? Like in
the
relation?
1880. 1907, something like that.
So like they're starting out, they got this whole thing, and then a big fire happens.
The fire happened in Key West.
Right.
Yeah.
I see. Talk about terrible timing. I'm reminded, this is a completely different scale, but I'm reminded of like when they're filming the first Star Wars movie in like Tanzania or whatever, you know, in the desert, and they got the worst rainstorm in like decades the day they were filming. Like the odds of that happening is crazy. So it's just terrible.
And sometimes
luck.
when things like that happen, you know, obviously other things are affected. In this case, it was actually ended up being terrible luck that I'm sure a lot of money and homes and probably lives were lost in the fire down there. But from the perspective of being able to establish Ybor City and have enough workers to facilitate this industry, it was a good thing because now the workers were going to stay in Tampa. They're not going to bounce back and forth between Tampa and Key West or Key West and Cuba or whatever. They were kind of in Tampa.
Right.
So
kind of
Tampa started to be able to be built. Partly it was kind of pushed along because of this fire in Key West.
Interesting.
Okay, so 1890, population 6,000. Not only do we have Ybor and Aya's factories, of course, but other cigar manufacturers from Havana, from Key West, and other places in the United States started moving factories to Tampa Bay. About 200 factories where there were only 750 people not even a decade ago. Now there's 200 factories there.
Wow.
And Ybor City became known as the cigar capital of the world.
I have heard that, actually. I think I forgot about it, but when you say cigar capital world, I'm like, oh, that does ring a bell.
Yeah. So does lightning capital of the world, I think.
Oh, I don't know that one.
But anyway, there were more than 12,000
workers. Is that because they're really speedy?
Lightning.
Oh,
no.
okay.
No. It has nothing to do with the cigar workers. It has to do with just the frequent thunderstorms.
Oh, that's a little less
lightning,
fun.
Not having to do with the hockey team or anything.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So now get this, 12,000 plus workers were employed in the cigar industry. And this is in 1890, 700 million cigars were produced a year.
Wow.
700 million.
That's quite the stock. They must have been making a lot of cash then if like.
Yeah, it actually was doing pretty well. It was doing pretty well. So immigrants came to work in the cigar industry from Cuba, Spain, and Italy. Primarily, Italians came last, I believe, and they came primarily from Sicily.
Oh, I was going to say that one's a little far out because like Cuba, okay, it's right there. Spain, okay, it's kind of tied to Cuba. Yeah. It's kind of in that same sphere, so to speak. Italy is like Middle East, Southern Europe.
This is the trouble with getting into the research is that I always knew that there were Italians in Ybor City, and part of my research touched on that. They actually, I think, they entered into Ybor City from like New Orleans, I think, if I'm getting my facts straight.
Interesting.
Because of some, like a sheriff's, like the head sheriff guy or whatever in New Orleans was shot by an Italian person, and all the Italians were kicked out of the city, something like that. And so some of them found their way to Tampa. So that was one of those branches of the research where I'm like, okay, Rachel, stop. You can't go down that. You've got to stick to the facts.
No, I know what you mean, because now I'm thinking about like how New Orleans is a very French city. And I'm like, man, America is such a melting pot.
And again, I hope it was New Orleans or New Orleans, however you say it.
However you say it.
Hopefully that was where they came from. But I imagined that they had come, straight to Tampa. Yeah. So I didn't realize. So that's just another sidebar.
That is interesting, though.
And all these things I had to sort of cut off around the edges because even though they're interesting, I'm trying to tell a cohesive story.
Welcome to my world. The reason why we do a lot of like looking at historical people is because there's a very definite beginning and ending.
Yeah. It makes it a little bit easier.
It's not like, well, I could talk about this or talk about that, but before you know it, you're like 1,000 miles off from what you're trying to talk about.
You're trying to get back to. So Cubans, Spanish, and Italians. So this cultural mix of people at that time was really unusual in the American South.
Sure, yeah.
Each of those groups of people created these mutual aid societies or clubs where kind of help take care of each other. And I kind of thought that's all that it was about. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. But what I learned in my research is that they began sort of as revolutionary support for Cuban independence in many cases.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that. So
is that just I'm sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, that's fine.
Was that just the Cuban kind of groups, or
Yes.
were the like Italian and Spanish groups?
No, primarily the
getting on
Cubans.
it? I guess that makes sense.
Started that but I think it was primarily just the Cubans. I don't know if the Italians were even quite
if they were even
prevalent
like, aware
in
of that.
1890, 1891.
Sure.
I'm sure they were aware.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. It makes sense to me because it's like if you have a group of people who agree on something and they're already kind of hanging out with each other, that's going to spark something.
Yeah, that's true. So,
that's how political parties form.
Really it was a center it was like a political hotbed, because a lot of the people that were cigar workers were from Cuba or from Key West, and a lot of them felt very patriotic towards Cuba and Cuba's independence from Spain.
Sure.
So just a lot of Cuban patriots there. In 1891, one of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, his name was Jose Marti. He came and spoke to people in Ybor City and tried to raise funds for the fight against Spain. So this was 1891. And Martí was just a really great guy. There's actually a statue of him in Ybor City.
Oh, cool.
He was fighting not just for freedom from Spanish rule, but he also was hoping, fighting against racism and oppression and exploitation of people.
Nice.
While he was in Tampa, he announced the creation of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, or the PRC.
Okay.
And within 5 years of his speaking in Ybor City in 1891, there were 41 patriotic clubs in Ybor City and West Tampa. Those 41 patriotic clubs, were the backbone of the PRC.
Cool. I mean, really, that's sometimes all you need is just like a charismatic person and a cause, or at least a position a lot of people agree with. And you got a movement going.
And he went on and fought and died in the war. And some people from Ybor City, also fought and died in the war against Spain. Here's the trouble with timelines too, is because it's not straight.
No.
So there's a lot of things that overlap. I just want to say just a very interesting note aside from the whole Cuban Revolution thing going on, is that between 1887 and 1893, nearly 20% of the labor force in the cigar factories were women.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was really fascinating at that time, that so many should be women. But anyway, so...
That's interesting.
Yeah. So in 1895, there's the Cuban War for Independence, 1895. In 1898, the war between the U.S. and Spain, U.S. sided with Cuba for independence, was taking place. Thousands of men, U.S.
I think I might have mentioned that in one of our immigration
did. It was the
episodes.
last one, I believe, that you mentioned.
Wow. But that sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah. Wait, that sounds, you're right. I could see you over there. You had your thinking face on.
I had the gears turning, Okay, sorry. Continue.
Thousands of men, because of the position of Tampa and Ybor City with the bay and the access to Cuba from there, by boat, it was a good place for people to be stationed or to station troops. And they were positioned in Ybor City. Have you ever heard of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders?
Of course, yeah.
So the Rough Riders were in Tampa Bay, and I think they were maybe even in Palmetto Beach, which is the neighborhood where my grandparents and great-grandparents lived.
That's interesting.
And
the history there.
There's a lot of interesting little tidbits of stories about the Rough Riders in Tampa, but I didn't gather too much trivia about that. But
that's fine.
Anyway, so the war ended. Cuba gained its independence, and it had a big impact on Ybor City, because now Cuban workers in Ybor City were like, well, should we go back to Cuba or should we stay here? Because by now they've been making a home in Tampa, so people had to sort of face that decision of going back to Cuba where they still had family maybe and where their kids were born, or if they should just stay there. So
that's always a hard decision to make.
I'm sure it must have been.
If you have ties to multiple places and you're not sure.
Yeah, I know that one personally is hard when you have ties to multiple places, where to go. Around the same time, Jim Crow in the South, social tensions were surfaced because people from Cuba, there were Afro-Cubans, I think they called them, and white Cubans. So that you had black and white Cubans, and sometimes
Cuba has a lot of, it's very ethically diverse in terms of like skin color and like
so while
background
they got along, they had this common fight for Cuban independence. They were also having to be separated in certain ways, but they really still got along. But they were required to have different clubhouses and things like that.
Right.
So it created some tensions for sure. By 1900, and we're still really in the baby years here. The hand-rolled cigars that came from Tampa, the quality surpassed those from Cuba.
Oh, wow.
That sounds like a very subjective statement.
It does, but I hear a lot about like Cuban cigars, and like how they're good.
All the tobacco was still coming from Cuba. It was still sourced from Cuba.
Right.
But yeah.
But they just had like a better cigars themselves, or I don't know.
They created a superior cigar, I guess. Yeah.
I've never smoked a cigar, so I wouldn't know quite like, I can't really wrap my head around that.
Yeah, how to tell what's good, what's not good.
Yeah,
and stuff
I'm
like
sure
that, yeah.
you could tell. It's probably like coffee or
Aficionados,
something. Yeah, where it's like, oh yeah, this tastes like it's from like the the West Coast or something. I don't know.
Somebody would know. Yeah, they had a reputation. So the cigar industry was booming like the first years of the 20th century. So for like 1902 to 1906, the industry just booming. So immigration at this time was really easy. Like basically you just had to show up and give your first and last name, and you were kind of welcomed into Ybor City. People were happy to see you, and there was a community for you to fit into. Everything was kind of in Spanish, and it didn't really even feel like part of the United States. To one account that I read, it was like I'm standing here in Ybor City and everything's in Spanish. I don't feel like this is part of the United States.
It's like its own little world.
It was like its own little world. Exactly. Yeah.
There are some areas like that today in the country.
I'm sure that there are some kind of isolated places.
There's like a town where like there are all a bunch of like Norwegian Americans or something like that, and it's like
it has a definite distinct culture.
Yeah, it looks like it's from Northern Europe, but it's actually in Minnesota or wherever, Yeah,
I think that's really cool. So in 1902, one of these social clubs I'm going to tell you about a little bit more was founded in 1902. And this one I mentioned specifically because it's the Centro Asturiano. It was actually called Centro Asturiano de Habana. So it was from Asturias, which is where a lot of the people who came from Spain, it's the northern province of Spain.
Right.
They founded their own club. That's where my and your ancestors are from, that province, and that's the club they belong to. So that's why I mentioned that one specifically. There's actually another one, the Centro Español, which is a Spanish club. And it's interesting that there were two different Spanish clubs, one the Spanish club and one this unique province in Spain club. I always kind of wondered why that was why there was a distinction. And it turns out that they split because at one time the Centro Asturiano wanted to build a hospital and there's some disagreement about it. And so people split and formed the Asturiano.
I swear people will find every reason and make up a reason if there isn't one to factionalize.
Yeah.
Like that's just what we do.
That's a good point. So anyways, really, and like with so many topics that you've talked about, any one of these bits, we could do a whole episode on just the Centro Asturiano, I think, and the history there because it's so rich and interesting. Okay. So moving on the timeline now, because there's a lot to cover.
Right.
In 1907, there was a fire. There seemed to be a lot of fires, but it destroyed a lot of homes in Ybor City. A lot of them were built of wood because that's what was the prevalent resource there. So while a lot of the factories were eventually built with bricks and stones, the homes were built with wood. In fact, the house in Palmetto Beach is a wooden house, and it's still on the brick pillars that they built houses on back then to get them out of the muck.
The swamp that Florida is. Yeah.
So, in 1910, there was a big strike. This is actually called the Second General Strike that stopped work in the factories for like 6 months.
Wow.
There were strikes and labor strife sort of riddled throughout the history. That could be its own topic. I'm not going to get into it too much, but
I get
it
you.
Disrupted work a lot. And so there's a lot of that going on, a lot of tensions like that. 1914 to 1918, World War I.
Right, yeah.
At this time, there's still hundreds of cigar factories, more than 20,000 workers, 400 million cigars produced annually. And at the end of the war,
is that just Ybor City or is that Ybor in Tampa?
That's Ybor City, I believe, although it could have been including the cigar factories in West Tampa.
Sure.
Good question.
I was just curious.
Yeah, it could have just been sort of the Tampa area. But when the war ended, the immigration laws were modified from coming in and just giving your name. They were very restrictive. It was almost impossible to come in and work. So if you got in that window of time before World War I, kind of it was easy. And that's actually when my great-grandparents came over, was in I think in the 1910s, in that first handful of years of that century. But in 1925 to 1930, the cigar industry already began to decline. So after the war, in the 1930s to the 1940s, so we're talking Great Depression time.
Yeah.
25% of the white immigrants and about half of the Afro-Cuban immigrants left Ybor City to either go find work elsewhere. There just wasn't enough work to be had.
That was a real rough time for, I think, everyone.
I imagine it must have been such a hard time. And it's weird looking back, reading about it and talking about it, because it's over. So there's not, the question of how, but when you're in the middle of something and going through it, it's really difficult.
Not that it's like the same in terms of trouble or like problems it caused, but in terms of like I'm just thinking of COVID right now, and I'm thinking how like in like 5 years, or 10 years, whenever we're gonna be looking back at this, and this is gonna be a history thing. It's not gonna be like it's gonna be something that you can look back on history and see, oh yeah, that this had a big effect and affected a lot of stuff, but it's over now, you know? So it's just one of those.
And right now when we're living in it, it's like the end is unknown still. It's like, I remember that time we had to wear our masks for a year and a half. It was like, what a drag that was. And all the businesses that, went under and just all the impact.
It's not quite the same thing, but it is like, it's just history is constantly happening, I guess is what I'm saying.
It is. And so we're living history, but it doesn't really feel like history until you're looking back on it.
Exactly. The last thing I want to say, then you can get back into it. Sorry, I had another thought. We were talking about the Great Depression is not the funniest, because that's not the right word for it, but the thing that always gets me about the Great Depression is President Hoover at the beginning of it saying how it's fine, don't worry, it'll be over in like a week or whatever. He was really trying to downplay it a lot.
And there's probably lots of reasons.
I'm sure, but
one being nobody can predict the future. Gosh, that's amazing.
He said a lot of stuff.
Okay, so back to the 1930s to the 1940s, people are exiting Ybor City. 1936 to 1939, the Spanish Civil War is going on. Have you heard much about the Spanish Civil War?
Oh, geez, not enough. I'm sorry, what was the years again?
It was 36 to 39.
36. So this was this when Franco came into power?
Yes.
Yeah.
See, you knew more than I knew.
I knew that he...
I mean, I've known that now for some time.
I know that he was Was he fascist?
He was.
Yeah, the fastest dictator of Spain during for a period of time like
almost 4 decades.
Yeah, I want to say up to like the 70s, but I don't know if that's accurate.
Jay, you're right. It was up to 75 when he died.
The reason why Spain didn't join the Axis during World War II is because they were in the middle of their civil war, and so it wasn't really like Germany or Italy or Japan, which had already been
What year did World War II start?
1938, 39.
What a messy time to be.
Oh, it was a dominoes of disasters.
Yeah,
really.
Seriously. So my mom was born in 1937, and I was just reading some of her memoirs and sort of in preparation of this.
And she was in Spain at the time?
No, she was born in Ybor City in Tampa.
Right.
And so in 1937, so in the middle of all this, and she was recounting how until she was like 8, I think, all she heard about was war. Like she was born into the war, like listening to the war stuff on the news. So her earliest memories of around age 4 or 5, she can remember war and, sacrificing stuff and the war effort and the war garden, all kinds of stuff like that having to do with, she said people on her street, in her block, and her family, everybody knew somebody who was in the war. And then the war was over, and she remembers the parades in the streets and just like spontaneous celebrations and things like that.
Because the war was over?
Yeah, because the war finally ended. I'm kind of jumping ahead and jumping off a little bit. But
how long did the war last?
No, not the Spanish Civil War. I'm talking about World War II.
Oh, okay.
My
that
apologies.
Makes more sense.
No, I'm sorry.
I was like,
she was talking about, I'm going to get back to the Civil War, Spanish Civil War in a minute, but just because we started talking about World War II.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, and how it impacted the United States, and how for somebody who was born during that time, I mean, you're born into that, and that's all you kind of know. You don't really have you don't have a place to put that kind of in a normal backdrop, like that is your backdrop. I don't know. It's just kind of a weird thing. Anyway, sorry, we got a little off on World War II.
No, it's fine.
It did impact, World War II really did impact this community as well. But okay, so the Spanish Civil War was taking place from 36 to 39.
Okay.
And just to kind of clear it up, so there were the
4
nationalists, which were the rebels. They received aid from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany.
Right.
They were funded, and that was Franco's party.
Yeah.
The Republicans received aid from the Soviet Union, and they received aid and support from the International Brigade. So those were groups of people, volunteers from Europe and the United States who went and fought or supported them. There's one called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade that, I mean, and again, a whole nother episode could be done about that.
It's so fascinating. There's so much stuff to unpack there. Like the fact that, and you could tell this is like World War II times because America and the Soviet Union were on the same side.
But really, it wasn't the American government.
Right.
They were like independent people who were idealistic and wanted to help. And there were reasons that, probably financial and political reasons that America wasn't jumping in to help, this democratically elected government.
Yeah, well, we had just got we got out of World War One, and then we just suffered like a massive depression.
Yeah.
So it was like the reason we were so late in coming into World War II is like we didn't really come in proper until Pearl Harbor, which was a couple years down the line.
Yeah, was that like 41 or something?
Something like that. Yeah. Is because a lot of the public was sick and tired of troubles, and we're like, we want to just stay home in America,
lick our wounds.
Yeah, basically, and not get involved in another global conflict.
Yeah.
So that might have had something to do with it.
It's hard. It's just really hard to imagine all that going on. But while this was happening, because it was the Spanish Civil War, and there are so many Spaniards and even the Cubans who, like I said, also had Spanish roots lots of times, really wanted to support the effort. So some of them were involved, like volunteered and actually went there, but a lot of them were involved in the way of donating. Like many of them donated 10% of their salary to the cause of the Republic and trying to push back Franco's whatever. So the whole community supported. And I heard stories like firsthand from my mom growing up, telling what she remembers about hearing stories about that herself. So it turns out like about 2,800 American volunteers went to fight and support. Not some of them fought, some of them were like doctors and other people who tried to support the Abe Lincoln Brigade. In the end, though, General Franco, of course, he won the war, or his side won the war. And again, the regime lasted until he died in 1975. The number of deaths during that 3-year period, impossible to determine. I saw a couple different accounts, and they vary widely from 500,000 to 1 million.
Wow. So that's quite
civilians,
the gap.
soldiers, all sides, the whole thing. So
I wonder if that
over 1% of the Spanish population.
Oh, geez. I want that, not discrepancy. That's something different.
Discrepancy?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want that conflict between like the differing numbers. I wonder if that's because some lists are not counting like civilian casualties or not.
I think so, because they probably account for them in different ways. So there's civilians, there's the soldiers on one side, the soldiers on the other side. So depending on who you're counting.
Yeah.
And then it talked about not only during the war, but after the war, because even after the war, Franco went after people who had been against him. So people died after the war.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's what dictators do.
Something I saw, a little factoid I saw, was there was a drop in the birth rate afterward, because of course all those people had died. So all those people of, young soldier age people, fighting age, whatever, died, so that there was a lull in birth rates. So you could also almost count that as, the population decrease. Doesn't really.
It's not death,
no,
but it's
an impact to the population.
Sure. Yeah, that happens. Like Japan currently is not because of like dictatorship or anything like that, but they have a problem with not enough people being born. Like their population is shrinking because like I can't remember, like the average age of a Japanese person is like significantly older than it is in like a lot of other countries for whatever reason. So it's just it's like a ongoing problem over there.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. For like I'm sure a number of reasons.
All we need are more problems to think about.
I know, but it's just curious though,
it really is so fascinating.
Stuff like that happens.
So just to kind of go recap, that was the end of the 30s.
Right.
Between the 40s and the 60s in Ybor City, because the cigar industry has really declined, there was a series of complex urban renewal policies that happened, and it was pretty convoluted. I couldn't come away with a clean answer, and I didn't want to spend more time
that's fine.
Getting lost in that. But in 1945, post-World War II, Ybor City continued to decline, even though Tampa felt some sort of like a resurgence. And the continued decline was due not only to the effects of the Great Depression still, but mechanization of making cigars. They weren't all hand rolled, so the machines came in, started doing them faster, and also the rise of popularity of cigarettes because people stopped being able to afford cigars, so they turned to cigarettes, I guess.
I have a question because obviously cigarettes are very unhealthy for you.
Are cigars unhealthy?
Yeah, well, I'm wondering, are cigars less unhealthy or more unhealthy? Honestly, I don't know, but
such a good
and
question.
I'm sure that didn't come up in your research.
Here's my guess, because it's definitely not researched, but to me, I'm thinking tobacco, cigars, pure tobacco leaves. Cigarettes have chemicals and other kinds of crap in them.
Yeah.
So I know that you could still die from lung cancer probably from smoking too many cigars, but I think, if I had to pick one over the other, I think cigars might be
slightly
quote unquote healthier.
Less terrible. Yeah, I got you.
I'm not sure, but boy, they sure smell good.
Okay.
I think they smell really good. They have a really distinct smell.
It's probably not to disagree with you, but I think it might be an acquired taste type of thing.
I'm sure it probably is. I've never actually tried to smoke a cigar.
Sure. Well, I just know that I love root beer. I can drink root beer all day, but if you give root beer to an European, they think it tastes like cough medicine.
Yeah.
So it's just a acquired thing.
Yeah. Well, apparently it was a very popular acquired taste because millions and millions of these puppies were made and distributed throughout the world. So there's something good about them.
Clearly, yeah.
So, okay, other things. For them. Yeah, seriously. Other things that contributed to the decline of Ybor City were that after the war and people came back, the houses in Ybor City, where a lot of them were the originals from the turn of the century or before, they were wooden, they were starting to show their age, dilapidated, that sort of thing. And veterans who were coming home, the government offered incentives for housing. So buy a new house, build a new house, and they got some sort of financial incentive to do that. Well, there wasn't any room in Ybor City to build new houses, and the ones that were there weren't new. So that caused a lot of them to not return to Ybor City. Also, there were incentives, government incentives for vets to go get an education, go to college. And so a lot of them went away to college, came back to the Tampa Bay area, but maybe if they did, they didn't settle back in Ybor City. They went to West Tampa or Tampa to settle again. They didn't return. So that was really the first generation that left Ybor City since its founding. So really a lot of factors that contributed to this booming town coming down. Okay, that was 1945. Okay. 1954, there were 5 Spanish language publications in Ybor City. So Spanish still vibrant, 1950s. The Tampa population in 54 was about 200,000 people.
Okay.
10% of them were quote unquote Latins. The tobacco industry, there's about 150 factories. So, diminished amount.
There's a definite drop off or decrease is maybe there's a better word for it. Because it went from really booming and then it got kind of hit by the the 1, 2, 3 punch of Great Depression, World War II.
Mechanization.
Mechanization, which wreaks havoc on people's income.
Yeah.
It always has. It's one of those things that's it's going to happen naturally.
Yeah.
But it's also
growing pains.
People rarely are prepared for it.
Yeah, for real. Mm-hmm. Okay, 1960s, one of the descriptions I read about Ybor City was that it was an urban slum. Wow. Now, mind you, while I'm doing all this research, I'm picturing my grandmother because she lived in the same house.
Sure.
And I tried to think back going to visit her, in the 70s or whatever. But it's really it just was falling apart. So that's somebody's description it was an urban slum. 1965 or so, there was a federal urban renewal project. So what was supposed to happen with this is they're okay, so we're going to get rid of all the old ugly stuff, the unsightly parts.
Old, slightly rotten wooden houses from
and we're going to rebuild. We're going to make it shiny and do something to draw tourists or whatever.
Sure.
So Ybor City was not the only area that was involved in this project. It was many, I guess, but I of course only focused on this one.
Sure. I'm sure there was a number of places like that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Honestly, there's probably still places like that in the country.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are. So at that time, a number of neighborhoods and historic buildings were razed, R-A-Z-E-D. So they were flattened, taken out.
Good spelling, because that word can mean several different things.
Yeah, including one of the social clubs called the Martí Maceo Club, which was the Cuban club for the Afro-Cubans.
Okay.
That was the only club that was destroyed. So it also seems like predominantly African-American neighborhoods were targeted during this razing, the urban renewal.
It would not be the first time or probably the last time that that's happened.
Yeah. And it's funny how even like sometimes like good intentions really can have some really negative effects for certain populations or subpopulations.
Especially if you put bigoted
areas.
people in charge of that.
Well, bigoted, yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that happened here because I don't know all the details, but I'm just saying that I do know that that does happen sometimes.
Yeah, and it could happen knowingly and it could happen not knowingly. So there's a lot there that, again, could be unpacked or researched further, but that's just one of the things that apparently came about. The plan to rebuild and draw new residents and tourists to that, the Ybor City's Latin Quarter didn't actually materialize.
Oh, really?
Either politically, there wasn't the willpower behind it, or there wasn't the financial power to do that. So empty lots. Like it just looked barren,
Yeah.
But they didn't get all of it. But so they raised a bunch of stuff.
Old and kind of dilapidated to empty and plain.
Right. But during that time, some people were like, wait, there's some historic buildings here. And a movement was started to preserve some of the buildings. So like over 900 of the original structures were preserved. Around this time too, a massive interstate went through, I-4 was built and cut through Ybor City, cut it off between north and south. So that also contributed to the downfall of it. So anyway, just like one hit after the other.
Yeah.
And that makes me, I'm drawing back to that thing I said at the beginning where, Tampa's pouring all this money into downtown Tampa, and Ybor City kind of just continues to survive. Not that no money has been given into Ybor City, and eventually and we're getting to it in the 80s, they did like a serious effort to revive Ybor City.
Right.
Took place, but there's been this sort of ongoing like hit after hit, kind of thing. City of immigrants, and
it just does not sound like it's going so well for them.
I know it kind of doesn't, right? But in 1974, Ybor City was designated a National Historic District.
Okay.
And the formation of the Historic Tampa/Hillsborough County Preservation Board was formed. So that's where some of the buildings were saved. Many, over 900. I think that's a lot.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not good at math, but I think that's a lot.
So in the 80s, this serious effort began to kind of revitalize it, turned it into sort of an entertainment district.
Sure.
Like a themed, kind of capitalizing on the Latin Quarter to draw people in.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting as well.
It is. So I wish I knew more about that culture because I don't. I mean, I know like some things, like I know how a lot of, at least I think I do. I could be confusing it with the other cultures, but I know how like there's particular types of fasten and architecture and stuff that's kind of associated with that, but I couldn't explain it in great detail. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I know. I kind of feel that way too. It's interesting kind of being on the outside looking in and wanting to learn more about that stuff. So that kind of brings us back to about today. I mean, 1980s is not today.
No, it's close. But
today, I kind of read that quote from the Gaceta guy. Today, it's I think it's kind of thriving. There's a lot more to tell. We're at a point, though, in the time that I think we should cut it. All right. So, Jacob.
Yes.
I knew that this was going to go long. I think that what we'll do is we'll kind of stop here.
Okay.
What I have left to do is to talk about details. I want to talk details about the cigar workers and the lives that they lived, because those were my grandparents. And it was such a big part of Ybor City. And I want to talk more about that. I also want to talk a little bit about the organized crime that happened during that time.
I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
I have to be honest.
Oh my gosh, so many details about that.
Cool.
And then, maybe just wrap up a few other things. But that's kind of the overall timeline of, the birth, and I'm not going to say death because it's ongoing. The struggle, I think the struggle is ongoing, but it's also, it's a wonderful place to be. I think I love it there. So
awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, wonderful. Well, this was a really interesting from my perspective because I don't know too much about the history of this district, city, whatever it is. Ybor, not the person. I didn't even know it was a person. So it was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I can see why you would be so interested in it. So not just because of like the personal history, but also because of the
there's so much going on.
Yeah, like there's a lot
and
of.
I really just scratched the surface.
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, that's why it's stretching out into a second episode.
Yeah, it is going to stretch out to a second episode. So real quick before we close up, though, this episode, I just want to mention this one book that I got some of my information from. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about Ybor City, go online. Check out ybor.org, the Ybor Chamber of Commerce. This book I have called The Ybor City Story. This is a funny little side note about this book. I had it in my shopping cart on Amazon like a year ago or more. I don't know. It's sort of like one of those save for later, wish list kind of items.
I get that. Yeah.
It was really expensive where it was listed. And I just thought that'd be really interesting because I own quite a few books on Ybor City. A lot of them are packed up. So I was sort of frustrated when we started. I was like, no, I can't find my books. But this one, I was like wandering through the house, and now we live with your grandpa, my dad right now.
Yes.
And I see this book that's in my shopping cart on Amazon still. Mm-hmm. It's lying there. I don't know why it was out, but it's just lying there. I'm like, wait a minute. This looks like the book in my shopping cart. I open it up, and there's a note written in here that my mom wrote in the book. There's a Post-it note, and it says that the author of this book, who actually it's not even the author. It was somebody who translated the book from Spanish to English. His name was Eustacio Fernandez. He was no relation to my mom, even though that was her maiden name. He was my mom's Spanish professor at the University of Tampa. I was like, what in the world? This is a crazy coincidence. So then I had to go back to my research, and this is a fascinating book. So it tells us the story of the history of Ybor City from 1885 to 1954, focuses heavily on the first part of that. And then the later part of it just kind of peters out. I don't even know exactly when it was printed. 1976.
Oh, well, that might be why then.
It's got a Ybor City State Museum, Tampa, Florida sticker on the back of it. So it wasn't a broad publication. It was probably just something for the gift shop or something. I don't know.
Sure.
But it was fascinating. If anybody wants to try to dig that puppy up, you can see that.
It's apparently on Amazon.
It's on Amazon, but not very many copies.
I got you, yeah.
But anyway, I'll mention a few other sources that I used in the next episode too, because there's just so much and so many fascinating things and so many places I want people to read about. So
I can feel like your enthusiasm about the topic, and that's really exciting.
I love it. So, okay, listeners, thanks so much for indulging us on this episode. I hope that you've learned something about Ybor City in Tampa, Florida. Please tune in next time when we go into some more detail and add a little bit of color and flavor to the timeline we talked about today, which is kind of like dates and people and the progression of events. Awesome. All right, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Confucius once said, "Study the past if you would define the future." You've been listening to the History Slices podcast with Jacob and Rachel. We hope you've gotten some useful information from the show. We hope we made you think, and we hope you were entertained. We know we had fun, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on Facebook at History Slices and on Instagram at History Slices Podcast. Make sure to like, rate, and review the show, and tell a friend about the show. That'll help us out too. One more quote before we go from Michael Crichton. If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. Till next time, this is History Slices, signing off.